Anthony, the time we got together, we were talking, of course, about CERN, and we want to continue that discussion tonight. We appreciate the fact that Lynn's allowed us the opportunity to come together, to talk with one another, have a conversation, and to share that with her audience. So Lynn, again, we appreciate that very much. So when we were talking last, the area that we got into, I didn't feel like we spent probably enough time talking about it, was the issue of quantum computing and why quantum computing is connected to CERN. And one particular manufacturer, D-Wave, we had mentioned that it looks like a black cube. We're going to talk a lot more about the black cube a little bit later in this program. But you might give the audience a little bit more background on just, why is quantum computing different than regular computing? Why is it really necessary at this stage? Why is it important to be connected with the CERN project? And then how is it really being exploited? Because it's really being exploited in some sort of more like normal ways, and then some ways that would be pretty unusual, pretty abnormal. So you might speak to some of those issues if you would.
Yeah, first of all, why is a quantum computer necessary? I'll first answer maybe a more elementary question: why is D-Wave effectively the only manufacturer of a quantum computer utilizing what are known as qubits or quantum bits? And that is because they worked with DARPA. They submitted a proposal to DARPA, which was approved near the year 2000. They received $10 million in funding for their initial research, and then it moved into the private sector for venture capital funding of about $20 million. And that's really the essence of where they got their start. So by doing that, pardon the pun, but they achieved a quantum leap over the basic technology of gate model transistor-based computers. Even transistor-based quantum computers do exist. However, the issue is that the superposition of quantum bits can only be achieved utilizing a four-state system of qubits. Four-state system being a zero in a binary system. A zero can also be a one at the same time that it is a zero, and vice versa. So you have a four-way, or what I call a quadnary relationship of what would ordinarily be binary. We now have a quadnary relationship of binary particles. That sounds like, gobbledygook, but again, a zero can be a one at the same time that it's a zero, and the ones can be zeros at the same time they can be ones. So you have a four-way relationship of two numbers. What D-Wave did that really advanced them in terms of manufacturing a quantum bit or qubit-based system was they actually were able to assemble qubits in a chip at the macro scale. Now, that was quite a change in paradigm because everybody had been moving towards the idea of building a quantum computer using qubits, but starting at the subatomic level at the quantum scale and then trying to scale up to the macro. They went the opposite direction. The reason is simply because of manufacturing technology that already exists in the transistor world that they could then transpose into the utilization of qubits on a macro scale chip. And that was the real leap forward in ability to make a functional quantum computer utilizing qubits.
Yeah, it's a completely different computer architecture than really the computers that have been developed and used up to this point in time, and it's being used to exploit and exploited as far as we know, we anticipate, I guess would be, we are concluding circumstantially that D-Wave is the computer being used at CERN for several different tasks. But there's no actual admittance or proof, is there, that D-Wave is the manufacturer? It's just kind of obvious because it's really the only game in town. Is that a fair statement?
That's a fair statement, and also I think if we reverse engineer what is going on at CERN and their openly stated goal of opening an interdimensional portal, when you look at the physics that are involved in actually opening a portal, which originates at the quantum scale, then you have to, by virtue of and I won't go into the details, but the essence of separating quarks at the quantum scale has to be achieved at the quantum scale by a control mechanism residing within that environment. And the only control mechanism that exists is the D-Wave computer.
Is it true to say that the computer is not really, and I'm going to use this word and it kind of would be subject to confusion, the computer is not an analog of a qubit, it is a genuine quantum based architecture, in which there are particles that can be entangled. So it's really dealing with quanta. Is that correct?
Absolutely correct. Yes. In fact, in order to operate at the quantum level, you have to do two things. First, you have to take the particles, the material that you're using, and cool them to a near zero state. What that does is allow stability, what is called coherence in computing, to achieve that coherence between the particles, between the literal quantum particles that have a spin rate and a direction of spin, up spin, down spin. They have different types of spin directions and rates that have to be stabilized in order to maintain quantum entanglement between the particles, between the quantum particles. So we're talking about, specifically in the case of CERN, we're talking about quarks. Well, there are literally thousands of different types of or named quanta out there, but quantum entanglement is the process by which information is exchanged between zeros and ones.
Okay. All right, and so we probably don't have to go much deeper than that, other than just to say that it is a genuinely distinctive type of computing architecture. It is really this sounds kind of funny to say, but it's at the heart and soul of what it is that CERN is trying to do, and the issue of colliding particles, dealing with quanta and so forth. It's not coincidental that a quantum computer is being used to deal with quantum collisions. So
let's pull back just for a moment with one last footnote, and that is, as I mentioned, CERN has stated they want to open a gateway, a portal. Now, that's an interdimensional process. D-Wave's computer operates in parallel dimensions, and you've got it on the screen here, 2 to the 500th power of parallel dimensions. Now, that was with the 512 model. They've exceeded that model to advance more more advanced models that have additional numbers of qubits, as you have here, 1024, 2048, 4096. Those are all the numbers of qubits and chipsets within the D-Wave computer. What I'm saying here is that you have CERN, a particle collider facility, seeking to enter another dimension. You already have a control mechanism that is doing that. That is what D-Wave is doing by their own statements, that they are accessing 2 to the 500th power of parallel dimensions.
And this is where there's a little bit of I would say maybe some confusion in my mind regarding, let's say, the distinction between dimensions as we're talking about in this like 2 to the 500th power dimensions versus, let's say, the 3 dimensions of height, width, depth, the spatial dimensions that we add to it time, and there's a temporal dimension. We're dealing with 4 dimensions. But for those of us that work with spreadsheets, we certainly understand that if you have, in effect, multiple spreadsheets cross-referencing each other, in effect, you're dealing with multiple dimensions, and you could be dealing with 10 dimensions or whatever. But that's
a good analogy. Let me interrupt you right there.
Yeah, go ahead. You probably know where I was going with that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a very good analogy of spreadsheets. If you had an Excel program and you had 2 to the 500th power of individual spreadsheets, the only thing that would be different between those spreadsheets would be 1 digit. So the single digit that is different is the qubit. So once you have an additional qubit, you have 2 more parallel dimensions that you can access. So every qubit represents 2 parallel dimensions, in essence. That's a simplified way of saying 2 to the 500th power. But I'm trying to break it down so that they are identical dimensions parallel to ours. If you want to say in a Euclidean model of 3 dimensions or 4th dimension being time, in the Euclidean model, they are identical. But when you access that parallel dimension, when you, in essence, insert an equation, you're inserting a qubit. Through quantum tunneling, you're inserting a qubit containing an equation, a problem. It's called combinatorial programming. And therefore, you change that other dimension by virtue of accessing it, utilizing that qubit. And that realizes or materializes in the quantum world a connection between what was an otherwise identical dimension but is now modified because we've accessed it. We've polluted it, if you will.
Well, and this is where one of the issues that I've got, which I wanted to have you speak to, is the distinction between, let's say, parallel dimensions and parallel universes. Because if I'm understanding it correctly, they're really not the same thing. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, they're distinctly different. Let's go to the universe. We consider, as humans, the universe, the cosmos out there, to be infinite in its scope and scale. And therefore, it represents, in terms of what we can detect and measure, utilizing our technology, we are seeing only one universe. And that universe, in the way that we detect it and measure it, is by way of a 3-dimensional Euclidean mathematical representation. We're modeling the universe with only 3 dimensions, but we add time to it so that it's really a 4-dimensional universe. But it's one entity, if you will. It is one environment. So if you're talking about multiple universes, you're talking about multiple distinct environments separate from ours. Now, in particle physics, the theory in terms of, we hear about the Big Bang, but we're talking about a model of a universe, how we construct our model of an environment. The theory in particle physics is that we actually originated from one universe, and that one universe spawned 8 different universes, 7 of which, and they don't really explain how, but 7 of which, let's just say they disappeared. They winked out of existence, leaving only one universe, which is the one that we reside in. And in the world of mathematics, in the world of, I don't adhere to sacred geometry because I'm a Christian, but in the world of sacred geometry, they reference most everything based upon the octarian mathematical model, meaning the number 8. Number 8 is significant and sacred, but you will see this in the Large Hadron Collider, for example, just one example. In a cross-section view of the CMS detector, it is arranged as an octagon. When you look at the cross-section of the Atlas detector, it is arranged in an octagon. So they view our universe through the lens of the number 8, calling it an octarian universe in particle physics.
Okay, and of course our system of math that we're all familiar with is a decimal 10 system, although traditional computer really is a hexadecimal or a sort of base 16 system, and so there are different mathematical, I guess you could say, sort of domains, and it is a significant factor, I think, also in the way they are trying to structure the work that they are doing. So,
Agreed.
Yeah, let's move on. The next slide that we're going to look at really deals with CERN. It deals with back to the sort of Berkeley connection. And you've made the statement in times past that the adiabatic quantum computer is equivalent to 7 billion brains. And I've also seen some lectures and heard folks indicate that the ability of a quantum computer to problem solve can actually solve complex problems literally 100 million times faster than a classical computer chip, even if it's a multi-core, multi-threaded computer chip. The quantum computer has the ability to solve problems that might take the fastest binary computer that we might know might take it 8 years to solve a problem, and the quantum computer can solve it in 30 minutes or something like that. Could you speak to that sort of exponential improvement in computing power and why that's important when it comes to what CERN is trying to accomplish?
Well, I'll work backwards. Why it's important in terms of what CERN's trying to accomplish is because when they collide particles within a detector, and there are 4 main detectors, it generates petaflops of data. And what you're trying to do is let me give you an analogy. It's like taking a sifter, a wire screen sifter, to the beach, and you're going to sort through every grain of sand on this given beach at one time, instantaneously. So you have to have the ability to crunch the numbers, and the numbers are generated for the purpose of examining the trajectory, the spin rate of quantum particles, the mass, their energy, their mass energy equivalent. So there's a number of things for each individual particle that they're looking at, and they are generating billions of particles per collision. It's called high luminosity. And therefore, it's an overwhelming task for a classical computer utilizing transistors to do. You're talking about, oftentimes people will see pictures of the servers residing at CERN. Well, that's well and good, but when you get into the higher luminosity collisions that are occurring in 2016, you have the ability to just swamp your servers. So what they've done is they've created a system, and actually they did this way back. This goes back 15 years at least. They set up a network, and this is why the World Wide Web was created initially, but just going back about 15 years, they connected CERN to over 60 major laboratories, and then they began to enlist the help of the general public, and that happened in 2015 and 16. They were inviting people to help sort through this information. My point here with the quantum computer is that it is the sifter at the beach that is nearly simultaneously doing 3 things. It's disregarding particles that they don't want to look at, that they've seen before, and therefore have a model of, and they can discount that particle. The other is they can take out decoherence or interference that's coming into the system. And lastly, they can identify the new particles that they're looking for. And they're doing that simultaneously, but they can only do that with a quantum computer.
And as I understand it, each collision, generates like terabytes of data just a massive amount of data. And it's not like these particle accelerators are all running all the time. They fire them up, they speed them up, and then they do a series of collisions, and then they collect data, and then they share that data across these servers. I think the slide says there's like 100,000 servers residing at CERN. There's obviously, hundreds of different locations around the world that are reviewing data, and it's a massive data mining, data storage, data warehouse, and data mining process, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, let me give you an example. We'll go back to the Higgs boson, and late 2012 and early 2013. It took approximately 6 months for them to sort the data, utilizing, this is back in 2012, utilizing the standard computing system based on transistors that they have. When you talk about the 100,000 servers and connecting to other laboratories using transistor-based computers, it took 6 months to crunch the numbers to where they arrived at a number that is not often cited, but they reached a 90%, not 100%, 90% level of confirmation of the detection of the Higgs boson, and they called it good at that point. They've exceeded that now. We're way beyond that point of 2012, but still it does take a massive undertaking. And so when we talk about the equivalency of 7 billion human brains, I want to be specific. That's only to the model 512 qubits. They've exceeded 512. They did that last year. In 2015, in February, they went to the 1024 model, and early next year in 2017, they're going to release the 2048 model. So we're moving well beyond 7 billion human brains in equivalency.
Okay. So we understand that the quantum computer is really crucial for the data mining and the data analysis. But another thing that you talk about is and we'll probably maybe defer this a little bit to later, but another one of the key elements of the quantum computer is the sort of opening up of this dimensional portal and keeping it open, keeping it sort of, or creating sort of like a super highway to connect, presumably from CERN to other points, perhaps in the solar system, as we'll talk about later with Saturn and Birkeland currents. But that is another function of the quantum computer that's unique to it that we believe is being exploited at CERN. Is that correct?
Absolutely is correct, yes, sir.
Okay. And so let's jump ahead. I want to move to the next slide, begin to talk about some of the dangers of CERN, because this is an area that so much has been done. There have been so many stories, and if you go out and you look at and Google this kind of material, the dangers of CERN, you're going to see a variety of things. But certainly, we talked briefly last week, the last program, about strangelets. You might remind people what strangelets are, and this fear that was brought up in 1982 by physicists Michael Turner and Frank Wilczek. They were worried about this thing called a bubble of a true vacuum bubble that could come across us as a result of being created by CERN and basically just wink us out of existence altogether.
Yeah, it's interesting because the statement by Turner and Wilczek was reproduced or acknowledged again by Dr. Stephen Hawking back in 2015, and he was saying that a vacuum bubble could be created that would, at the speed of light, envelop not only the Earth but our entire known universe. And he was relating that to not so much a black hole, although he has talked about the creation of micro black holes that possibly could be created at CERN, but really what he was reflecting is a more accurate representation of what strangelets can do. And strangelets have three characteristics. First of all, to define a strangelet, this is a quark gluon condensate. The gluon is both a particle as well as a force that binds together quarks, and typically they're arranged in an arrangement of three. And last year they even went to a pentaquark that they said that they discovered. So an arrangement of quarks bound together, they have three principal characteristics. One, they are akin to, and I call them as the cousin to a black hole. Cousin in the sense that a black hole, which is theoretical only, but is described as having such a tremendous gravitational attraction that even light is unable to escape the core of a black hole. Well, akin to that attraction is the fact that strangelets are stable, all other matter being unstable in a characteristic. And therefore, the stable strangelet will attract unstable matter to itself. It then also has the characteristic of being so dense, like a black hole, that it cannot be contained. And therefore, once produced in the laboratory, as it was at Brookhaven with the relativistic heavy ion collider at 10 TeV, CERN operating well above 10 TeV at 13.5 to 14 TeV also likewise produces strangelets. They leave the laboratory, they leave the collision site in the detector, and they plummet to the core of the Earth. At the core, they are electromagnetically balanced there and remain at the core, and therefore begin to attract the natural environment around it, which is unstable matter, to itself. This is the process by which, theoretically, a neutron star is created. Effectively, we're talking about converting the planet Earth to a neutron star. It is also the third characteristic. It is also the most explosive substance in the known universe, because in the timeline of the Big Bang, the singularity, when it exploded, produced first strangelets, which then produced the Higgs boson.
Mm-hmm. The next slide really gets to this point. I titled it "Journey to the Center of the Earth."
Okay.
And on this slide, we talk about these different particle detectors that are used, as well as the new awake particle accelerator, which is a linear accelerated, which really is being combined with the circular 27-kilometer Large Hadron Collider as well. But these are the devices. In effect, they're sort of like, I guess they're almost like photography, because they are actually sensing and tracking, or able to see, in effect, the path of these particles. And you might talk a little bit about the importance of these different detectors and the role they play in the process of particle collisions and so forth.
Yeah, overall, the analogy to photography is an accurate one, because the detectors have hundreds of very small sensors arranged so that they're pointing towards the center point of a cylinder. So picture a long cylinder, and the walls are lined with cameras, and those cameras are pointing towards the center line of this long cylinder. That's essentially what we're talking about. Now, each one of these is set up to look at different types of expected particles within the detectors themselves. So what will happen is the main ring has two beams of particles. They can be protons, ions of lead. They can even be photons. But the point is they have two different streams. Sometimes they are identical streams of particles moving in opposite directions at 99% the speed of light. But most often what they will do is they'll have one beam that is carrying ions. That's typically what you would consider to be the counterclockwise moving beam, with the clockwise moving beam being protons, or it can be swapped out. But you have two streams, one of protons in this example, and the other is ionized or ions of lead. And then they will either cross those at 45 degrees within a detector, those beams crossing the streams, if you will,
right.
or they will actually, in the case of lead, ions of lead, have the streams impact head-to-head within the detectors. But within each detector, those detectors have different types of cameras that are looking for different types of expected particles resulting from those collisions.
Yes, and so the joke you sort of alluded to was, of course, back to the Ghostbusters, and it literally was the case that these were supposed to be on the backs of the 4 Ghostbusters mini particle accelerators, and they were, of course, we remember the line of Egon Spengler, don't cross the streams. I think he said something like, he said, there's something very important I forgot to tell you. Don't cross the streams. It would be bad. Try to imagine all life as you know it, stopping instantaneously and every molecule in your body exploding at the speed of light. So,
it's not far-fetched. And let me, just as a touch point of history, back at Berkeley, the real essence of these synchrotron particle accelerators began at Berkeley with Dr. Lawrence, and what they first built was actually a particle accelerator that you could hold in your hand. And their budget was so small, they were cobbling it together with spare parts. So when you look at the Ghostbusters cobbling together things into a backpack particle accelerator, it's not that far from the origins of synchrotron particle accelerators.
Yeah, it's the best science fiction, of course, is always dealing with hypothetical or experimental physics or science, if you will. And so there was a lot of occult information in Ghostbusters as well that they. Talk a little bit about the danger of the explosions. The fact that strangelets are created at a 13 or 14 sort of TeV, tera electron volts, and yet as they moved up during this past year to the lead ion head-on collisions, they jumped that power by 1,000 times to peta-electron volts, a quadrillion volts. What does that mean, really? And it would sound like when you say those numbers that the whole sort of installation should just be sort of singed and fried by that kind of energy. But explain why it is that kind of energy and what it really means in terms of like heat and light generated and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, the short answer is we're dealing with picoseconds of duration of these extremely high temperatures, and therefore they pose no risk to the outside environment, to humanity themselves. So let's define the energy. When we're talking about tera-electron volts and peta-electron volts, we're talking about the mass energy equivalency of each individual particle. Now, the analogy at the tera-electron volt level, let's use 10 tera-electron volts as an example, often cited by the supporters of what is going on at CERN, is that that's equivalent to the power or the energy generated by the beating of a mosquito's wings. Now, we start to think, well, then there's nothing to worry about here. And I'm not saying that the collisions are anything to worry about themselves. I'm not. But what I am trying to define for people is that we're talking about billions of particles. We're starting to use our math skills. We're talking about simple multiplication. So if you take the energy of the beating wings of a mosquito and multiply it by billions, we start generating significantly large numbers of energy. It isn't energy that we have to worry about, that we have to be concerned about, nor are the resulting temperatures or the scattering of the particles, because the particles basically, once they are realized in the detector from a collision, wink out of existence in such a brief moment in time that is barely measurable. Same thing with the temperature that's generated upon the collision. So none of that is really of concern. But to grasp the nature of the numbers of tera and peta-electron volts, we're talking about the mass. If you want to call it the weight, that's fine, but the mass of each particle. But the particles are arranged in bunches, and the bunches are separated in time, not at distance, but in time of 25 nanoseconds. That's a more precise measurement than trying to say millimeters or centimeters or nanometers even. So they're separated in time, but essentially they're a solid stream of particles moving at near the speed of light. And when you're talking about 27 kilometers in distance, that's a long, solid stream of particles. We're not just talking about small numbers of particles being collided. Now, it's not solid, but I'm giving you the analogy that it is solid. So
almost would seem like that they could aggregate, and as they aggregate, those tiny picoseconds begin to build up into a more sustainable length of time in which there could be heat and so forth, energy being built up. Is that true, or is that a false sort of conclusion I'm drawing?
Now, what is resulting from what we can just euphemistically call two solid streams moving opposite directions at the speed of light, what you're producing, rather than talking about heat, we're talking about magnetic lines of force.
Okay.
We're also talking about synchrotron energies, which are defined as gamma rays and X-rays, are produced. Just the circulating. We're not even talking about colliding. We're only talking about the movement of particles accelerated through a magnetic field that then generates magnetic lines of force, which are orthogonal or at 90-degree angle to their trajectory, to their circulating pathway. And the magnets serve the purpose, the superconducting magnets serve the purpose of doing two things: holding the particles to a circular trajectory within the center of what they call the pipe, but the ring itself, and holding it in that center trajectory to keep the particles from colliding with the inner walls. The other part is they have what are known in the detectors, what are known as collimators, and collimators squeeze down using magnets. They squeeze these particles into a very, very small pinpoint beam or stream of particles. All of that results in magnetic lines of force, gamma rays, and X-rays. These are affecting the magnetosphere of the planet.
Anthony, what I'm hearing you talk about are some things that could lead to some, terrestrial impacts or dangers. Again, if you look at a lot of the articles being written about CERN, so much of them deal with earthquakes. And could you talk about whether there is real evidence that CERN is doing something? I think you've alluded to the magnetosphere. Talk about that and talk about this issue or this fear of earthquakes that CERN may supposedly be influencing.
Yeah, I think some of the empirical information or evidence can be derived when we look at the antipodal, the opposite point on the planet from CERN. So if you imagine a line drawn through the planet itself from CERN to the opposite side, you then realize the antipodal point on the planet. Now, and you combine that with time. So if we talk about time of occurrence of an earthquake and then backtrack to CERN itself and look at their activities. I'm not saying every time, but oftentimes when collisions occur at the 13.5 tera-electron volt level, we see on the opposite side of the planet, for example, New Zealand, we see significant 7.0 upwards to 8.0 earthquakes taking place. The other point of that is more commonly, and I think more accurately, we look at the effects upon the shields of the planet, the magnetic lines of force, the magnetosphere, magnetopause, shielding us from gamma rays and X-rays, synchrotron energies coming in from the cosmos. When those change shape, the morphology begins to change concurrent with the activities at CERN when they're colliding particles at high luminosity. In other words, when they're colliding significant numbers of particles up and around 13 to 13.5 tera-electron volts, we see the shape of our shields changing. Now, because they're shields, if they are weakened, distorted, or even parted, then we see the influx of accelerated particles like protons and electrons and gamma rays and X-rays coming in not only from the sun, but the cosmos itself, and those are impacting the Earth. What that has the effect of doing is striking the core, heating the core, and then that heat moving out to the mantle and the crust, and thus you have the excess movement, tectonic movement of the plates, separating, not so much the subduction of plates, but the separating of the tectonic plates, resulting in increased earthquake and volcanic activity.
Well,
that has a more direct correlation.
On a grand scale, it is sort of the cooling, the contracting, the expanding, things that causes cracks in the highway in the wintertime.
There you go.
Yeah, it's kind of the same principle, isn't it, except on a planetary scale. So, well,
I think the effects on our shields are more important than discussing antipodal locations and effects.
Okay, well, that's a good clarification. Moving on, let's begin to move to some of the spiritual issues, kind of still dealing with astronomy too, though. Looking at the slide, the rings of CERN to the rings of Saturn. And one of the things that was discovered, I guess, in the 1970s was this hexagon shape on the northern pole of Saturn, and then this sort of spiral aurora at the southern pole of Saturn. Talk for a moment about that and kind of what you know about those and why those might be significant.
Yeah, we'll break it into two categories. One is the physics that are involved, and the other is the spiritual aspect to this. Beginning with the physics, the hexagon at the northern pole of Saturn is a synchrotron particle accelerator. Now, we can call that naturally derived, but for the sake of discussion, we'll call it a natural particle accelerator because it has contra-rotating clouds of accelerated particles that are identical in the fashion that it operates to what CERN is doing. CERN has copied the northern pole of Saturn, the mechanisms. So Saturn is generating synchrotron energies at the North Pole. Those generate Birkeland currents, and it has been definitively detected and measured that the Birkeland currents, which are charged particles, it's a helical double strand of oppositely charged particles that arrange themselves like DNA. And that, once generated at the northern pole, actually penetrate into the gaseous body of the planet to the southern pole. And they exit the southern pole in the form of this spiral. And the spiral is very much akin to the Norway spiral that we observed, I think it was in 2009 when President Obama received the Nobel Peace Prize.
Right.
So I'm just giving that as a touch point for people. But what we're talking about here, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to ask, the spiral is a bit like, it's an electromagnetic reaction, I suppose. It's like an aurora borealis, if I'm not mistaken.
Absolutely it is. And what you're seeing here is the end point of the twisted helix. So you're looking at the cross-section of the Birkeland currents as they terminate at the South Pole.
Okay. Interesting. What is the mechanism that is causing it really is a naturally created hexagon shape at the northern pole of Saturn? Mm-hmm. Do we understand, I guess physicists talk about angular momentum. Is it a function of the spin of Saturn or the bulk, the size of it? that is causing these particles, in effect, to be, I guess you're calling it a cyclotron?
Synchrotron.
Synchrotron,
yeah, just like the Large Hadron Collider's main ring. We're looking at a main ring on the northern pole of Saturn. The way that physicists typically try to describe the natural arrangement into a hexagon is they talk about the eddy currents, the backspin, if you will, of the movement of what they call clouds, but these are actually particles, charged particles that are accelerated and causing these eddy currents like you would find along the edges of the banks of a river. Now that's very plausible, but let me underscore this with my model of the universe, in that the universe is actually composed of tetrahedrons, and this is definitively shown both at the quantum scale and also at the cosmological scale, that the universe is arranged in tetrahedrons. These are four-sided pyramids with the base being a triangle rather than a square like you'd find in Egypt. So with that said, tetrahedrons naturally form a sphere, and that's why the planet, and virtually every planet that we observe, including our own, sorry, flat earthers, but that's why, yeah, I had to zing that in there. That's why you see these tetrahedrons, because the planet is a sphere naturally composed of tetrahedrons, and at the northern pole, they exhibit themselves that because of this synchrotron effect, this particle accelerator effect. Now, I had a conversation with Richard Hoagland a few months ago, and Richard Hoagland and I were on the air, and I said, Richard, we were talking about, because he spent a lot of time talking about the northern pole of Saturn, I described what I just said to you in the audience, and he had not heard this before, that I was describing it as a synchrotron particle accelerator in Birkeland currents. And he and I agreed that the eddy currents are responsible for the hexagonal shape. But I said to him, as a side note, I said, if you have the proper instruments on a satellite over the northern pole of our own sun, you would see exactly the same hexagon and synchrotron energy effects going on at the sun. And he was stunned. He said to me, how do you know that? And I said, it's simple. It's the geometry of the universe. And it's the plasma. This is where we're getting into the next part of this. It's the plasma that surrounds everything in the universe. The universe is not a vacuum. It is filled with ionized gas. It is a conductive medium. And planets and stars are formed by the gathering of this plasma, the condensation, the coalescing of this plasma, forming planets and stars. And he said, well, let me tell you something. What you just revealed is something that very few people are supposed to know.
Most interesting. Wow, that's pretty impressive. Yeah, and
now that was recorded on his show. That's in his archives.
Oh, well, I wish you'd make his shows public so we could all listen and participate. So, but that's his business model. Well,
yeah,
you know,
I understand. So the spiritual side.
That's right. Well, the occult makes a considerable amount about this concept of a six-sided figure on the northern pole of Saturn and its connection with Saturn worship and so forth. And it, in effect, is it's suggesting that that it's like a if you look at a cube from a particular angle, it will look like a six-sided figure, and with what is it? With 7 points, I suppose. And this gets into some deep occult mysticism, which we'll talk a little bit more about. We're just about at that point. I wanted to jump and talk about this guy named Norman Berglund, or Bergrum, who published a book. I think it was back in like 1986, so it's 30 years ago. But it was called, and I bet you have some familiarity with it, "The Ringmakers of Saturn," and these sort of electromagnetic vehicles that he postulated that seemed to be included in photographs from one of our voyaging spacecraft that NASA launched. And it looks as if, and the theory is that it's actually spacecraft of some sort that are, in fact, depositing material that are forming the rings of Saturn. Do you know anything about this?
I've not read his book, but I do know enough that it tells me that I don't know enough about these spaceships.
It's a video certainly that's been out there. I've watched his video. I've heard him talk about it, the speculation. It's one of these additional sort of mysteries of Saturn that that is has added to the cult theories and conspiracy associated with Saturn and the occult. But these pictures, which we show some of them on the slide that we're looking at, it is another puzzler that is unique to Saturn, and so it's something that adds more color, I guess, to the story. But the concept that that Saturn and the rings are artificial, not necessarily natural, is that's pretty wild. Mm-hmm. Jumping from that, yeah, go ahead, make a comment, please.
Real quick. The rings are natural; they're not artificial. They are a product of the synchrotron energies that I talked about, and also the magnetic lines of force. If you picture the main ring of the Large Hadron Collider, that is, and pick that up and put it at the equator in a cross-sectional arrangement. If you put it at the equator of Saturn, you kind of slice the planet in half and put the ring in there. It then, when it accelerates particles, generates at 90 degrees outward from that accelerator ring magnetic lines of force, gamma rays, and X-rays. What the magnetic lines of force begin to do is to gather plasma from the ether. The plasma, Tesla's ether, begins to gather the plasma from, let's call it the cosmos, from the vacuum of space, if you want. But it's gathering plasma. That's what the rings are really composed of. Yes, people want to say that they're rocks and dust and all that. That's fine. But what you're really talking about is the manifestation, the visual manifestation of the magnetic lines of force from a synchrotron particle accelerator reaching out and gathering plasma into concentric rings. Mm-hmm. Now, as far as these spaceships that are out there, it very well could be, from a Christian standpoint, I consider, most of the UFOs that we see out there to be man-made. But there's an element, I just use a number of 10% and say that 10% of what we're seeing are craft that are put together by fallen angels. And this comes from Scripture. I would say my conjecture, without having a lot of knowledge of Mr. Berglund's book, but just the photographs and the few videos I've seen of his work, I would say that these craft are constructed by fallen angels, demons, if you will, demonic entities that are creating craft that they need to move into our dimension. Now, that is just, ridiculous on the surface. But if you dig into the spiritual research that I have done, and you have done as well, you begin to see that there's that element of possibility in the conjecture that I make, that these craft are not necessarily from aliens, but given their scale, they're not human-made from our planet. They're not Earth original, because the scale of these things are such that I would say that they're more from the fallen angel end of the spectrum.
Well, they add to the deception. There's no question about that, and you're exactly right. If we had the time, we could jump into the whole UFO phenomenon and talk about the connection, but we don't have time in this program. Yeah. Moving on, I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about Stanley Kubrick, the great filmmaker who's made, of course, many films. Perhaps the most famous, 2001: A Space Odyssey, but also films like Clockwork Orange, The Shining, Barry Lyndon, even Spartacus. I had forgotten that he was responsible for Spartacus. But I've been, of course, myself doing some study and watched a film by a filmmaker named Jay Weidner, who talks about Stanley Kubrick's sort of obsession with the Illuminati and the Saturn death cult, and that many of his films seem to be thematically tied in to this whole issue of the Saturn death cult, and Eyes Wide Shut being perhaps the most provocative and the most clear cut. And so this seems to be something that he was very obsessed with and was seeking to expose, that he had apparently a lot of interaction with and communication with the elite, the Illuminists, and that his stories reflect this both directly, such as in Eyes Wide Shut, and then indirectly in movies specifically like The Shining and Clockwork Orange and 2001: A Space Odyssey. And I don't know to what extent you've had a chance, Anthony, to study that, but the parallels are pretty phenomenal.
They really are, and as I understand the backstory to his films, in particular 2001, was that he and going back to Arthur C. Clarke, who wrote the book which the movie is based on, 2001, Arthur C. Clarke and Kubrick actually wanted to film Saturn, not Jupiter. And they wanted the scenario of the black monolith to play out at Saturn, because Saturn, according to the worshippers of the black sun, being Saturn, the worshippers and adherents to what is known as the golden age of Kronos being Saturn, this reaches back into Sumerian, Babylonian, and Egyptian history. But Kubrick and... Go ahead.
No, that's all right. Go ahead.
Okay, that's your interrupt. No. Kubrick specifically, but also Arthur C. Clarke, understood the occult worship of the black cube residing within the core of Saturn itself. But they understood that they could not address that planet specifically, so they went to what was spawned by Saturn was Jupiter. Jupiter was formed from Saturn. And rather than a cube, they used a rectangular black monolith. And by the way, the black monolith represents the black cube, not only within Saturn, and not only the one at Mecca, but it also represents the black cube because it is artificially intelligent, the black cube of D-Wave.
Yeah, and we see this, of course, we alluded to it a little bit last week. We see this in so many religions, that there is a black cube at the heart of it. As I have been doing some additional research, poking around in this, what appears to be the case is that the occultists see Saturn as the black sun. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But they originally saw our sun as a symbol of the light, and Saturn as a symbol of the dark sun. And of course, the Electric Universe folks talk about it as being formerly a brown dwarf, but it was thought to be the last of the planets, of course, when the alchemists were sort of in their heyday, and not knowing about Neptune, Uranus, Pluto, and any other of the minor planets that are subplanets that might be out there. But that was the reason why Saturn was known as the dark star, the dark sun, or the black sun. And so this is you're right. This is the incorporation of the black monolith. Clarke's book originally called it the Sentinel. It was actually named the Sentinel, not 2001: A Space Odyssey, and it was related to. He was talking about Saturn, and eventually talked about this monolith being on, I believe it was on Iapetus, but in the movie 2001, it was shifted to Jupiter. And it was shifted to the planet Europa on Jupiter. And you see this also carried forward in 2010 sort of the sequel to 2001. So the number of moons, the mysteries associated with these moons, both at Jupiter and at Saturn, are phenomenal aspects of this whole story. What was another intriguing thing, which is a slide I've added that you don't have in front of you, Anthony, is about The Shining and the Apollo moonwalk. The Shining, according to Jay Widener, and then there's another gentleman I'm reading now, I believe his name is Isaac Weisthoff, kind of like the Weisthoff from the Illuminati. That's a little interesting that his last name's Weisthoff. But there's a lot of material going in and probing the symbols of Kubrick's movies. And long story short, the Shining appears to be a confessional, a statement by Kubrick that he was connected with the Illuminati, and that he was paid to create photography, or the moonwalk, the moon landing, and that it was in fact faked. Now, Widener doesn't say that it is necessarily the case that the moon, that we haven't been to the moon. It may be more the case that the folks that were the Illuminati that were paying Kubrick to do this, they wanted to be able to control what was being seen on the moon, because the fear was that there were many things on the moon that could be exposed by a camera that the Illuminati don't want us to know. And so it needed to be shaped and controlled by a filmmaker. And so supposedly, while he was creating 2001: A Space Odyssey, he was also creating the scenes that were used to, in effect, show us what the moon looks like. And, of course, the film Widener goes into great detail to talk about some of the cinematography and the cinematic tricks that were done. But what's really interesting is all of the symbols, and probably the one we only have time to talk about is Danny, the little boy who appears to he certainly has some type of an emotional problem, but it's certainly been speculated that he has been abused by the character Jack Nicholson plays, his father. And like so many stories, even like in Pizzagate recently, that supposedly the Illuminati are corrupted by pedophilia. And the idea was that Kubrick was pointing out that Danny was in fact disturbed because of sexual abuse by Jack Nicholson's character. But regardless, you see throughout this theme of red, white, and blue in so many different scenes, different characters. Danny is always wearing red, white, and blue, and so on and so forth. But there's a scene where Danny rises up in the hall when he first sees the twins, and on his sweater is the Apollo moon rocket, which was really the Saturn V, but it says Apollo 11 USA. And it was about as explicit a hint as he could provide that this was something that he had done, and he was having great regret that he was involved in faking the photography of the moon landing. So it adds another layer of intrigue and conspiracy to the whole story of Saturn, the cult of the dark sun, and so forth, which again Kubrick was sort of telling stories out of school about the Illuminati. At least that's what many have speculated.
Yeah, and I'll add to that I would encourage the audience, if they want to do a little research on their own, look at the connection between Osiris and Saturn.
Right.
And that will really lead you down some rabbit holes of what you're talking about.
Yeah, the connection between the pantheons of the Greeks and the Romans, even the Babylonians and the Egyptians. Osiris Nimrod, who many believe was the origination or the human incarnation that led to Osiris and Orion and so forth. And so let's move on, though. Let's talk a bit about the black sun and talk about the symbols of Saturn worship, which is for my slide 30, probably about slide 28 for you. But this was a very important symbol for the Third Reich. You might talk a bit about that, if you would.
Yeah, in fact, if you look at the Polaris star that actually forms a swastika, and it rotates in the heaven. And that is something that is directly related to the activities of CERN opening a portal. Now, that's just a little side note on the swastika, but the swastika represents Saturn. It represents the worship of the black sun. And for the Nazis specifically, if we're going to talk about it in that relevancy, as opposed to the swastika being prominent in the Hindu religion, but with the Nazis, they truly believed that the origin of life and the origin of the Superman, the super race, and the new race of beings that they wanted to bring about really originated with what they felt was the origin of mankind, which was Saturn itself. And that speaks to the whole issue and their worship and their belief in the golden age of Kronos. Mm-hmm. And they were trying to recreate, the Nazis specifically, and this is carried forward to today's activities with the Illuminati, with the Jesuits in particular, this reconstruction of the golden age of Kronos here on the Earth, and also connecting Earth to Saturn.
Exactly. Kronos and Saturn really were seen as, in effect, one and the same. And of course, it's very easy and very obvious to connect Saturn to Satan, and the concept of evil, even going back to 2001. It was a symbol that's pretty obvious. When the ape hits the bone and throws the bone up into the sky, you immediately shift from 4,000 years before with the ape that has learned how to use a weapon, to a satellite circumnavigating the globe that happens to be a nuclear satellite and represents the military-industrial complex and the fact that mankind has made their weapon systems even more evil, and that evil was a big part of that. And so that's the Saturn, Kronos, who ate his young, the dark side, if you will. And so very, very much a big part of Luciferian worship, that it's a dualism, the polarities of both good and evil, and that it's important for us to transcend by embracing both good and evil, which is not, of course, a Judeo-Christian point of view. It's very occult.
Yeah, and if you will, the Nazis really were New Agers. We call today's New Agers, really, their practices are no different than the practices and beliefs of the Nazis. And I only point out the Nazis because it's so new and fresh. I shouldn't say new, but fresh in our memories.
Right.
But if you're more contemporary, but if you reach back into the Greek and the Roman and the Egyptian cultures, you see all of this planetary relationship of the godheads and the deities and the powers between them played out. And this all carries forward right to what is going on with CERN and with D-Wave's computers. All of this reaches back into those former days. So when we talk about secret societies and we talk about hidden knowledge being carried forward through the eons, we arrive at today and we see the manifestation in our technology of knowledge that was provided back to the ancients by the fallen angels, back into the days of Noah. And previous to the days of Noah, we're talking about forbidden knowledge that was forbidden for our protection. But now we're seeing the technology that is seeking to breach the veil to access all forbidden knowledge. But The Nazis had their advanced technology because they were already, through spiritual means, contacting fallen angels and obtaining that forbidden knowledge, which manifested in their weaponry. Now we're seeing the same process with D-Wave's computers and with CERN, the manifestation of that forbidden knowledge.
Yes, one of these symbols is a symbol of the Vril, the symbol of the Thule Society, which the Vril supposedly were assimilated into. Maria Orsic, the primary medium, assimilated into the Thule Society. There's this one of their ensigns or logos from 1919 is a curved swastika, which of course Joseph P. Farrell points out is indicating a sort of toroidal motion, and the twisting motion and so forth being, of course, a part and parcel of what happens at CERN. So these things are very much connected.
Yeah, he's calling them a torsion field. There's a toroidal, yes, which is the donut shape, which is what our magnetosphere is. That's a toroidal field in the donut shape of magnetic lines of force. And then you have the torsion field, and you're correct. That's what is represented in these symbols, is that twisting of a torsional field. Now, it brings up, again, from the physics side, if you picture the main ring of the Large Hadron Collider, and it's producing these magnetic lines of force, which then manifest around the ring like a donut, with the hole in the center of the main ring of the collider itself. So that's one manifestation in physics, is the toroidal field of magnetic lines of force. Now, on top of that will be produced these torsion fields, these twisted fields of charged particles above the main ring, above Geneva. That will then in turn, in the center, if you're looking at the screen, look at the red graphic there. Mm-hmm. That's a very good representation of what I'm talking about from a bird's eye, straight down perspective. Coming out of that center of both the torsion field, the twisting, and the toroidal field, which would be your outer circle in this graphic, coming straight out of the center are the twisted pairs of charged particles known as the Birkeland currents I talked about with Saturn. Mm-hmm. Those will be produced by the activities of the particles in the synchrotron particle accelerator, and those will extend from CERN to the southern pole of Saturn to connect with the Birkeland currents that are generated at the north pole of Saturn, moving through the core of the planet to the southern pole. And the core of the planet of Saturn also has a black cube residing within it.
And of course, that we'll jump. I'm going to go through a series of slides quickly, but you've mentioned the black cube, which certainly is symbolic of Saturn. But the question is there really a black cube inside Saturn? And that's something we talked a bit about in the former program. And it remains to be one of the main mysteries of the whole issue of Saturn and Saturn worship and so forth. Going through quickly some of these, the worship of Saturn and the black cube, it's a worldwide phenomenon. The black cube of Saturn can be seen in effect, little monuments or statues or pieces of art in Australia, Denmark, Manhattan, Santa Ana. We see it sort of all over the world. You see the black cube. It represents the god Set, the Egyptian god Set, the ancient Egyptian god of evil, darkness, chaos, war, and conflict. Again, this is a principal part of occult worship, the duality really reflected early on in Zoroastrianism, but very much part of occult worship. One of the specific cults that gave rise to Aleister Crowley, I mentioned this last time, is the Brotherhood of Saturn. Stephen Flowers has done some extensive work, his PhD, in and on the German Brotherhood of Saturn, which gave rise to Aleister Crowley's Ordo Templi Orientis, and prior to that, the Order of the Golden Dawn. And so the number 42 plays a major part in a number of Kubrick's films. We've talked a bit about Troy McLachlan. Anthony, the bottom line is that Saturn is very special, and we haven't talked a lot about Saturn as the perfect sun or the golden sun, the time of the golden age, and so forth. But in terms of in our day, it's very special because it does seem to be at the base of a lot of these strange occult religions. But not only occult religions, if we look at, for instance, even the black cube and the Kaaba in Mecca, we see the people, the pilgrims, circling the black sun, if you will, the black cube, as if it is the rings of Saturn. And so I don't know, did this intrigue you? When did you kind of discover that this was sort of part of the whole story of CERN? I was wondering if it kind of shocked you the way it did me when I began to learn of this.
Yeah, there were two things that really got me to look at the spiritual side of CERN, because as you know, since my experience in the military in the 70s, when I first became aware of CERN, I had looked at it from the standpoint of this is really cool technology, really cool machines. I really enjoy physics as a hobby and was fascinated with it. But back in about 2012, I realized that there was a spiritual component to the activities at CERN and really was setting the agenda for all of the technology, the employment of it. And I discovered, not only the Hindu relationship in terms of the statue of Shiva that is so prominently displayed at CERN, but also the worship of Saturn that was going on, and specifically the black cube of Saturn. And that all was connected with CERN. And then I began to realize, moving through 2012 and 2013, when I first wrote my first book in 2013, the connection to CERN is to the Vatican, specifically the worship of Saturn, which is actually Satan, the worship of Satan by the Pope, and that there are two popes, the white Pope that everybody sees, and the Jesuit black Pope, the Jesuit general. And the Jesuit general has his people in place as physicists and engineers, as well as administrators, has his cadre of Jesuits, people that were educated in Jesuit schools, who are working at CERN and who are the ones that are actually directing this worship of Satan through the technology. And the reason for opening the portal is to open the abyss that lies directly beneath the machine.
Well, and that really takes us to what is the last slide that we want to talk about tonight, which is entitled From Saturn to the Abyss. And, one of the questions I've got is, to what extent is this concept of a black cube actually being embedded within the planet Saturn? Is it, clearly it's a symbol. That's very obvious. But, it sounds as if there are those that think that it's more than a symbol, that there really is a black cube at the core of Saturn, that this was part of Stanley Kubrick's disclosure in 2001: A Space Odyssey, and that others have, that it appears that perhaps the elite that may be behind the founding of CERN might in fact have envisioned that they would be able to connect through a current, through the Birkeland current, to this black cube. What are your thoughts? To what extent do you put stock in the idea that the black cube might truly be resident in Saturn? Is it a symbol or is it more?
No, I'm convinced primarily from a physics standpoint that there is a black cube within the core of Saturn, again, relating back to the northern pole of Saturn, producing not only the hexagon, but also the hexagon itself manifests the shape of a cube at the northern pole. But this is an energy field that resides in the core of the planet, and the energy field is comprised of the arrangement of the Birkeland currents into a cube. It's all about geometry. If you look at the twisted helix will provide the shape of a cube, but it's an energy. It's not a solid cube. It is an energy field in the shape of a cube. Because when you talk about I'm trying to be brief here, but when I talk about tetrahedrons and tetrahedrons forming a sphere, in this case a planet, one of the intermediate steps, if you're looking at in the analogy of freeze frames, if you look at the replication process of a single tetrahedron out into multiple tetrahedrons which form a planetary sphere, at intermediate steps of that replication, you will have various forms of geometric Platonic solids created. One of the Platonic solids created when tetrahedrons reproduce is a cube, and therefore what you're seeing is this tetrahedral arrangement of the Birkeland currents, the twisted helix, in a freeze frame of a cube. It's an energy field, and in the mystic world, in the world of the occult, they believe that this energy field is actually a prism. It is therefore not only a prison holding the spirits, what they call their titans of old. It is not only imprisoning their spirits, their spiritual leaders, their seven godheads, but it is also the key to opening the abyss. If they can connect through the Birkeland currents from Earth to Saturn, they can break this energy field, forming this cubical prison, and therefore release these godheads back to the Earth and back to the opening simultaneously, the opening of the abyss within our planet. They open both the cube at Saturn, they open the abyss here on Earth at the same time, releasing not only the Titans and Saturn, but also the remaining cadre, if you will, of demonic entities and spirits from the abyss into this realm, into this reality. And that is the scenario that the occult, including the Pope, both the black and the white, believe in and are pushing for, and has been their reason for worshiping Saturn and placing the collider at CERN over the doorway to the abyss, the temple to Apollyon, Abaddon the Destroyer. This is a concurrent scenario between two planets that will play out.
That's of course it's so much to wrap our minds around, but the fact that, as we talked in the last program about the connection between the particle accelerators, the mapping of DNA, that these things are not coincidental, that they play together. The Birkeland currents, understanding that the nature of the cosmos is that it's not an empty vacuum, but that it in fact is filled with plasma, and that it is a means to propagate currents, and that many of the features of the planets, a lot of the craters and so forth that we see, are not craters caused by volcanism or impacts, but they're craters caused by what's known as basically electromagnetic machining of and creating flat-bottomed craters and so forth. So there is, in effect, real science behind the notions of the electric universe and so on. But talk about the issue of the sort of the DNA sequencing. Is there really a concept of attempting to teleport spirits or the DNA of spirits that might be the titans of old in this black cube? It's kind of like the Phantom Zone in Superman, the idea of Zod and his henchmen being trapped in this Phantom Zone and sent out into outer space. So many of the ideas in Superman, of course, really have come from occult concepts, even Baal worship, because Kal-El and or Ka-El and so forth. You have the name El, the original name for God, and Baal and so forth. So there's a lot of really intriguing parallels, and it's clear that these ideas in these movies came from occult religious concepts. But talk about this issue of, is the Birkeland current really to be a means of teleporting DNA sequencing of titans from Saturn to the bottomless pit, as it's called, to the abyss on planet Earth?
Yeah, first we'll start with the characteristics of Birkeland currents, and these are naturally occurring, as you say, in the plasma of the cosmos, and they are photographed by Hubble telescope to extend light years in distance. So these naturally occur in that plasma medium. The issue of teleportation, I would call the plasma conduit. I would call the Birkeland currents between CERN and the southern pole of Saturn a plasma conduit, a conduit which will channel charged particles, an energy wave that will first extend to Saturn and then return from Saturn, both the spiritual as well as the physical DNA, the digitized DNA of the fallen angels, the Titans, will be transmitted electrically as charged particles through the Birkeland currents back to the doorway to the abyss, which is what the Large Hadron Collider itself is the doorway to the abyss. So when we talk about digitized DNA and sequenced DNA, this goes to the work of many scientists in the world of DNA that are actually using a digital sequencing of our DNA. They use particle accelerators to determine the protein folding of DNA, and then all the way down, and I'm being very brief here, all the way to the quantum level of the arrangement of quantum particles in our DNA. They were then able to convert the pattern of DNA to ones and zeros, to binary code. They were able to digitize or place in a software program the pattern of DNA components. Let's just say the proteins themselves, just to be brief. So they digitized the protein folding, which was inferred using hard X-rays produced by synchrotron particle accelerators, such as at Berkeley, where the Human Genome Project, the mapping of the genome project, and Dr. Craig Ventnor's own DNA was mapped using the synchrotron particle accelerator at Berkeley. They have now gone to the extent of digitizing DNA, and what that means is that you can use a sequencer and the base chemicals, the amino acids of DNA, and you can arrange the components of DNA any way you want. You can design it in the software. You can design the DNA code any way you like and resequence it with a sequencer. So you can first sequence a sample of DNA, and then you can resequence it at the other end. You can transmit it through the internet, through the cloud. You can transmit it from Earth to Saturn, from Saturn to Earth. It does not matter. This has all been proven out in the laboratory. They are able to produce a biological copy of the original DNA at a distance. So this is a form of teleportation, if you like, but it is actual science. And this is the mechanism by which they will not only free the Titans from their energy cube using these Birkeland currents, but they will also be able to use that as a plasma conduit to then bring both the spirits and the physical digitized DNA back to the abyss and reconstruct them here on Earth. You can't separate the physical from the spiritual. They are conjoined.
It's an amazing amount of issues that are kind of concatenated together, tied together, and it basically boils down to springing, I guess, the Scorpion King from his imprisonment in the abyss. And of course, many speculate that really is Nimrod, who was the first archetype, if you will, of the Antichrist, and that ultimately Nimrod plays a key role in this in the arrival, I guess, of the Antichrist. So I guess we have to leave it there because time is really run out. But Anthony, thanks a lot. I enjoyed the conversation. I hope that the listeners have enjoyed it as well. And we certainly want to encourage everyone to take a look at Revising Reality, a biblical look into the cosmos. Invite you to order books from Anthony, if you'd like, at his website, which is anthonypatch.com. If you are interested in an electric copy, you can certainly acquire those from Amazon, from Kindle. The other authors, Josh Peck, Gonzo Shimura, also have copies. So if you'd like to obtain a copy signed by one of the authors, invite you to do so. And we're going to be working on Volume 2. Anthony and I are already doing a lot of planning, and we have some very, very specific areas that we will be speaking to, and we're very well aware of these as we had a general plan that was constructed, and the details now are being fleshed out. So we hope to have that second volume done by sometime this summer. But also, Anthony, you're going to be doing a new book and releasing a new book very soon. Do you have an idea as to how soon it's going to be, and do you have a working title yet?
Yeah, the working title is Coalescence, because everything is coming together, and we are working extremely quickly at getting this out by the end of January, and it will complement the work that we've done with Revising Reality, and it will act as a bridge to Volume 2 of Revising Reality. So, yeah, we are all working on the same page, my friend.
No, it's exciting, and it's certainly groundbreaking, and it's certainly controversial as well, provocative to say the least. So, all right. Well, Lynn, we'd like to turn the show back over to you. Thank you again so much for the opportunity to share our ideas and thoughts with your audience, and we hope that it's a blessing to everyone, and we appreciate the opportunity so much. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, and God bless you guys. And this has been Anthony Patch and Douglas Woodward on the Lynn Liaz YouTube channel. If you're not subscribed, subscribe today to youtube.com/Lynn Liaz, LYNLEAHZ. Thanks again, gentlemen, and I can't wait to have you back.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it.